My son and his wife tried to have me declared incompetent just so they could steal my house and throw me in a home. They trapped me, took my keys, unplugged my phone, and tricked me into signing the very papers that would take everything away, all while pretending to be my loving, concerned children. They thought they were dealing with a confused old woman, but they had absolutely no idea about the $62 million secret my husband left me, and the perfect, satisfying way I was about to use it to deliver their final judgment. You know, Sunday dinners used to be the bedrock of my week. A simple pot roast, mashed potatoes, my famous green bean casserole. It was a time for connection for family, but lately something had soured. It wasn't the food, it was the air thick with a kind of anxious cheerfulness that didn't belong in my quiet little house. Mark, my son, and his wife Tessa were the source of it. They were just too helpful, too attentive. It was like watching a play where the actors are trying a little too hard. Tessa was constantly hovering her voice a pitch too high as she'd ask if I was sure I should be lifting that heavy casserole dish or if I needed her to cut my meat for me. It was all cloaked in concern, but it felt like she was building a cage of frailty around me, one sweet-sounding question at a time. Mark was worse in a way. He couldn't seem to look me straight in the eye. His laughter was always a beat too loud, booming out at things that weren't particularly funny, and a little muscle in his jaw just kept twitching a tiny, frantic dance of a secret he was holding back. They'd exchange these quick, nervous glances over the gravy boat when they thought I wasn't looking like two birds worried about a hawk circling overhead. After we ate, the smothering continued. The phone rang, and I knew it was my neighbor Marge calling for our usual Sunday chat. Before I could even push my chair back, Tessa had snatched the receiver off the wall. I heard her tell Marge in that sugary voice that Mom just needed her rest, that she was a little tired today. I wasn't tired, not in the slightest. Then Mark started gathering the mail from the little table by the door, offering to sort through it for me, just to take one more thing off my plate. It all felt so reasonable on the surface, just a son and daughter-in-law trying to care for their aging mother. But it felt less like being cared for and more like being handled, managed. The worst of it came later as the afternoon sun slanted through the kitchen window. Tessa sat me down at the table with a thick stack of papers and a pen. She said it was just some updates for my Medicare supplement plan, nothing to worry about. Her words were a fast-flowing river of jargon, deductibles, copays, new coverage tiers, all designed to sweep you along so you don't have time to think. She pointed to each signature line, her manicured finger tapping on the page. For a fleeting second, a little voice in the back of my mind whispered for me to stop, to read what I was signing. But Tessa's hand was on mine, warm and insistent, and after a whole day of their relentless care, it was just easier to give in. It was easier to trust my own son. So I signed where she pointed over and over, the scratch of the pen on the paper sounding far too final. They left soon after that, leaving a strange, hollow silence in their wake. The house felt settled again, back to its usual quiet rhythm. I went into my little sewing room, a place that always brought me peace, and picked up a pair of my late husband Frank's old work pants. Mending his things always made me feel close to him. The house was completely still, so still that I heard the faint click of the front door opening again. I figured Mark had forgotten his phone. I stayed put, threading a needle when I heard his voice from the hallway. It wasn't his usual voice. It was a harsh, panicked whisper, the kind of sound a cornered animal makes. He wasn't talking to me. I leaned closer, my breath caught in my chest. "The extension is denied," he hissed into the phone. "We have until the 30th before they file the notice of default." There was a pause, and my blood ran cold. "No, she doesn't know anything. This has to work. It's the only way we can make it right." Then the door clicked shut again, and there was only silence. I sat there in the fading light, the needle frozen in my hand, Frank's old pants in my lap. Notice of default, making it right. And the most terrifying words of all: she doesn't know anything. In that moment, the loving concern, the smothering help, the stack of papers I'd so trustingly signed, it all snapped into a new, horrifying picture. And I was right in the middle of it. By the way, if you're enjoying the story so far, please consider subscribing so you don't miss what's next. We'd also love to hear your own story if you'd like to share it with our community. Now, let's get back to it. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat in Frank's old armchair in the living room, watching the moonlight creep across the floorboards. The shock from Mark's phone call had settled deep in my bones, a cold, heavy thing. But as the hours passed, something else started to stir. It was a feeling I hadn't felt in years, a quiet, stubborn anger that my Frank would have called grit. He always said I was tougher than I looked. By the time the sun started painting the sky in shades of pink and gray, the fear was still there, but it had a new companion resolve. I wasn't just some confused old woman they could push around. I was Frank's wife. And I was going to fight for his house. The next morning, I made breakfast just like I always did. The smell of coffee and bacon filled the kitchen, a fragile little bubble of normalcy. Mark and Tessa came down, their faces carefully arranged into masks of concern, asking if I had slept well. I just smiled and poured them coffee. I let the silence hang in the air while we ate, the clinking of our forks, the only sound. I waited for the right moment. Then I put my fork down, dabbed my lips with a napkin, and looked right at my son. I made my voice sound casual, a little forgetful, just an old woman thinking out loud. I asked him about that safe municipal bond he'd helped me invest in 5 years back, the one he was so proud of. I said I was looking at my bank statement and couldn't find it. I asked him if he remembered the QSIP number, just a string of letters and numbers, so I could look it up for my records. It was like I'd pulled a pin from a grenade. Mark froze his coffee cup halfway to his lips. The color drained from his face. He started to stammer something about market fluctuations and how it was complicated. He couldn't meet my gaze. That's when Tessa jumped in, her voice a little too bright, a little too loud. She said they'd moved the money for me into a much better, higher yield fund, something with a better return. She said they'd been meaning to tell me. Their stories didn't just contradict each other, they crashed into one another. The air was thick with their panic. They weren't looking at a frail old woman anymore. They were looking at someone who remembered things. And it terrified them. That was all the confirmation I needed. The betrayal was real. After they cleared the dishes, their movements still jerky and anxious, I told them I was running low on my blood pressure pills and needed to run to the pharmacy. It was the perfect excuse. Getting out of that house felt like coming up for air after being held underwater. At the pharmacy, I waved to old Mr. Henderson behind the counter and asked if I could use his office phone for a private call. He just nodded, bless his heart. My hands were trembling slightly as I dialed a number I knew by heart. It was Dale's number. Dale was Frank's best friend from the VFW, a semi-retired lawyer who was sharper than a tack and loyal as a hound dog. When he answered, I kept my voice low and steady. I told him it was Ruth, that something wasn't right with Mark. I asked if he could come by for coffee on Thursday. Then I added the most important part. I told him not to call the house first. When I got back home, the atmosphere had changed again. Their panic had curdled into something harder, something more controlling. They were waiting for me in the living room. Mark walked over, his face a mask of gentle concern, and gently took my car keys from my hand. He told me he'd spoken to my doctor, and the doctor had suggested that maybe I shouldn't be driving for a little while, just to be safe. It was a lie, a bald-faced lie, but said with such patronizing kindness that to argue would have made me sound hysterical. A few minutes later, I saw Tessa walk over to the landline phone on the end table and unplug the cord from the wall. When I asked her what she was doing, she just smiled that tight, bright smile of hers and said the phone had been causing some strange interference with the Wi-Fi. The lies were getting sloppier, more desperate. The house was no longer my home. The walls were closing in, and I realized they weren't just trying to manage my money. They were trying to manage me. When you're a prisoner in your own home, you have two choices. You can rattle the bars and scream, or you can sit quietly and study the lock. I chose to study the lock. My little outburst at the breakfast table had shown my hand, and it cost me my car and my phone. A direct fight wasn't going to work. They were younger, stronger, and they had already outmaneuvered me. So I did the last thing they expected me to do. I gave up. Or at least I made it look like I did. I started playing the part they had written for me. I became more forgetful. I'd ask Tessa what day it was. I let her sort my morning pills into the little plastic container without protest. I even let Mark help me with my checkbook, nodding with a confused look on my face as he explained the basics of balancing an account, a task I'd done perfectly for 50 years. The final touch was when I sighed one afternoon and told them that maybe they were right. Maybe this old house really was getting to be too much for one person. The relief on their faces was immediate and overwhelming. They exchanged a look, a tiny, triumphant smile that said, "It's over, we've won." They believed my spark of defiance had been a fluke, a final flicker before the lights went out for good. Of course, I didn't know the whole truth then. I couldn't have known the sheer terror that was driving them. But looking back now, I can see it all so clearly. I can picture them in their own kitchen, the one with the granite countertops they were so proud of. I can see the crisp official letter lying there like a snake in the grass, a notice of foreclosure. I can almost hear their frantic whispered argument, the ugly words hanging in the air between them. They'd been seduced, you see. A charismatic man on the internet, a so-called fintech guru, had promised them the world. He spoke of crypto startups and a new digital frontier, a can't-miss opportunity to build generational wealth. And they believed him. They poured everything into it, their savings. Mark's retirement fund, even a second mortgage on their house. And then it all vanished, collapsing into nothing overnight. The shame must have been suffocating. They couldn't tell. Their friends couldn't admit their failure. So they looked at me. They looked at my simple, paid-for life, and all they saw was a solution. Getting me declared incompetent, getting control of my assets, it wasn't just about greed. It was a desperate, last-ditch gamble to stop the bank from taking their home and exposing their failure to the world. While they were relaxing, thinking they had me all figured out, I was busy. My afternoon naps became the most productive part of my day. With the bedroom door locked, I'd go straight to Frank's old roll-top desk. That desk was more than just furniture. It was a history of our life together. My fingers wrinkled, but steady traced the familiar grain of the wood as I searched. In a small, hidden compartment Frank had shown me years ago, I found what I was looking for. It wasn't much to look at. Just a small, cold brass key on a simple ring. It was the key to our safe deposit box at the bank in Grand Island, a box I hadn't opened since he passed. Tucked right beside it, inside an old address book, was a business card. It was thick, expensive paper with elegant, embossed letters. It was for a law firm in Omaha. And under the lawyer's name were 3 small words that made my heart beat a little faster: Ellis Agricultural Trust. My little performance as a frail, confused old woman was working better than I could have hoped. They became arrogant. They saw me as a problem that had been solved, a piece of furniture that just needed to be moved, and their arrogance made them careless. One afternoon, Mark rushed out for an errand, leaving his leather briefcase sitting on the living room sofa. For a moment, I just stared at it, but my quiet Midwestern politeness had been burned away by betrayal. I walked over my hands steady and clicked open the latches. Inside, lying right on top, was the hard proof of their entire plan. There was the official court filing scheduling a competency hearing for the end of the month. Beneath that was a property appraisal for my house, the number insultingly low. And tucked in a side pocket were several glossy, tri-fold brochures for a place called Sunset Gardens, with smiling, silver-haired residents sitting in sterile cookie-cutter rooms. Seeing it all laid out like that, so cold and clinical, didn't make me sad. It made me furious. It was the final piece of fuel I needed for the fire I was about to build. The 2 days leading up to Thursday were the longest of my life. I carefully put Mark's briefcase back, making sure every latch was closed. Every paper was exactly as I'd found it. Then I went back to my role. I was a ghost in my own home, quiet, compliant, and forgetful. I let Tessa micromanage my meals. I nodded vaguely when Mark talked about finances. All the while, the image of those court documents was burned into my mind. The fury I felt was a hard, cold stone in my gut, and I held on to it. It kept me steady. When Thursday morning finally arrived, I sat in my armchair by the window, my hands folded in my lap, and I waited. Right on time, just as the 10 o'clock news was starting, Dale's old Ford pickup truck rumbled into my driveway. Mark and Tessa exchanged an annoyed look. They weren't expecting company. When the doorbell rang, I saw the tension in their shoulders. Dale stood on the porch, a big, solid man with kind eyes and a handshake that could crush walnuts. He gave me a warm hug, his presence immediately making the air in the room feel a little easier to breathe. He was polite but coolly professional with Mark and Tessa, accepting a cup of coffee with a quiet thank you. After a few minutes of strained small talk, Dale got right to the point. He set his worn leather briefcase on the coffee table, opened it, and pulled out a thin folder. He looked directly at Mark, his friendly demeanor gone, replaced by the lawyer he was. He said he'd been reviewing some of my estate documents as a favor to an old friend. He told Mark he'd noticed a recent petition filed with the court for a competency hearing. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. Then he said that the petition contained claims about my mental state that, in his professional opinion, were entirely baseless and could be considered fraudulent. That was it. That was the pin that burst the balloon. Mark just collapsed. It wasn't loud or dramatic. He just seemed to fold in on himself, his face in his hands, and a terrible, ragged sob tore out of him. The whole story came tumbling out, a messy, shameful confession, right there in my living room. He told me everything: the slick online guru, the crypto scam, the second mortgage, the foreclosure notice. The words were choked with a lifetime of shame and the raw fear of being seen as a failure. He kept saying he had lost everything, everything his father had worked for, everything he was supposed to protect. He looked up at me, his eyes full of tears, and said, he just thought if he could get control of the house, he could fix it. He could make it all right before anyone had to know how badly he'd failed. For a split second, I felt a pang of pity for the broken little boy sitting in my son's place. Tessa felt no such pity. Her face, which had been pale with shock, was now flushed with a hot, sharp anger. She didn't collapse. She erupted. She turned on Mark, her voice a venomous hiss. She screamed at him, asking him how he could be so stupid, so gullible. She said he had told her it was all legal, that it was a necessary step, the only way to save their home. She revealed that she had gone along with it all based on his assurances, on his lies. The unified front of my concerned, loving children was gone. In its place were two desperate, terrified people tearing each other apart, spitting blame and ugliness all over the life Frank and I had built. I let them go. I let the poison spill out until they had nothing left, until they were just breathing heavily in the sudden, awful silence. That's when I spoke. My voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the silence like a knife. I just said, "That's enough." The shift in the room was instant. They both stopped and stared at me, their mouths slightly open. I wasn't their victim anymore. I was in charge. I looked at Dale, who gave me a slight, steady nod. I told them that Dale had already prepared a motion to dismiss their ridiculous petition. Then I gave them their orders. I told them he had scheduled a meeting for Monday morning at the offices of Knudsen, Miller, and Beck in Omaha. A name they'd never heard, a place far from the comfort of their deceptions. I told them, "Be there." There was no room for argument in my voice. There was only the cold, hard weight of consequences. They just sat there, broken and powerless, utterly terrified of what was waiting for them in the city. The weekend passed in a thick, strange silence. Mark and Tessa moved through my house like ghosts, their faces pale and drawn. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed dread. I continued my routine, making meals they barely touched, while Dale and I spoke in low, calm tones, making our preparations. On Monday morning, Dale drove us all to Omaha in his big, steady pickup truck. The 2-hour drive was completely silent. I watched the flat, endless Nebraska fields roll by, the same fields Frank and I had built our lives on. And I thought about how a family just like the land could suffer from a blight that rots it from the inside out. The law offices of Knudsen, Miller, and Beck were on the top floor of a glass skyscraper that seemed to scrape the clouds. It was a world of polished marble, hushed tones, and expensive suits, a world designed to make a person feel small and insignificant. We were led into a sterile conference room with a massive dark wood table that reflected the gray sky outside. Mark and Tessa huddled together on one side, looking like lost children. On the other side sat myself, Dale, and a woman who introduced herself as Miss Albright. She was the trustee lawyer, a stern-faced woman in a perfectly tailored power suit, with not a single hair out of place. She was the human embodiment of a legally binding contract. Ms. Albright didn't waste time on pleasantries. She opened a folder and, in a cool, methodical voice, laid out their entire scheme. She detailed the documents they'd had me sign under fraudulent pretenses. She referenced the petition they had filed with the court, highlighting the willfully false information it contained about my mental state. Mark stared at the table, his face ashen. Tessa just twisted her hands in her lap. Then Ms. Albright paused and slid a thick, leather-bound portfolio across the polished table until it stopped directly in front of them. She told them that this was the real reason we were here. She explained that it was the Ellis Family Agricultural Trust, founded by my husband in 1998 to protect the land and our legacy. And then she delivered the final devastating blow. The current valuation, she said, her voice devoid of any emotion, was $62 million. And she added, according to the terms Frank had established, I was the sole, unchallengeable trustee. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of my children's world completely shattering. They stared at the portfolio as if it were a bomb. I watched the dawning horror in their eyes, the sickening realization of what they had tried to steal and how little they had understood. The judgment, when it came, was not from me. It came from Ms. Albright's cold, professional voice. She informed them that their petition to declare me incompetent while I was secretly managing a financial empire of this size was not just frivolous, it constituted felony elder fraud. She let that sink in for a moment before adding that her office had already conferred with the county attorney. The threat of actual prison time of public criminal humiliation suddenly filled the sterile room, and I saw true terror on their faces for the first time. That was when I finally spoke. My voice was quiet, and it felt heavy with a sorrow that went bone deep. This wasn't a victory, it was a tragedy. I told them I would offer them a choice. I would not press charges. I would instruct the trust to pay off the debts they had incurred from their foolish investment. I would even give them a small fixed inheritance amount, enough for them to start over somewhere else, but not enough to live a lavish life. But the offer came with conditions, and they were permanent and non-negotiable. They would have to sign a binding legal agreement right here, right now. It would sever all financial ties between us. It would relinquish any and all future claims to the estate. And it would enact a permanent no-contact order. They could have their survival, but they would lose their mother, their family, and their entire history. Broken, ashamed, and utterly defeated, they took the pens Ms. Albright offered. With hands that shook so badly they could barely form their own names, they signed away their birthright. The drive back from Omaha was the quietest 2 hours I have ever known. We were 3 strangers in Dale's truck, the weight of those signed papers sitting between us like a tombstone. Dale dropped Mark and Tessa at their front door. There were no goodbyes. I watched my son and his wife walk into the house. They had almost lost the house they had sold their souls for, and I felt nothing but a vast, hollow sadness. Then Dale drove me home, and as I stepped back into my own quiet house, I knew a chapter of my life had irrevocably closed. Of course, in a town like ours, secrets don't stay secret for long. The story, or at least a version of it, spread not like a wildfire, but like a slow-moving fog, seeping into every corner of the community. People knew. They knew the competency hearing had been dropped. They knew Mark and Tessa were no longer welcome in my home. The for sale sign in their yard vanished, but it was replaced by something far worse, a profound social silence. People would tell me how they saw Tessa at the grocery store, how everyone was perfectly polite, but no one would stop to chat. Their pew at the back of the church sat empty on Sundays. They had been saved from financial ruin, but they were now socially bankrupt, living in a town that had quietly and collectively turned its back on them. As the seasons turned, I heard whispers of the different paths they had begun to walk. Tessa, from what I was told, remained bitter. She kept their house immaculate, a perfect facade of normalcy, but she was a prisoner in it. She blamed Mark for everything, his weakness, his foolish dreams of getting rich quick. She was angry that their plan had failed, not that it had been wrong. Mark, however, was a different story. The shame that had broken him in my living room seemed to have humbled him. He took a job at the local hardware store bagging nails and hauling lumber. It was honest physical work. People said he rarely spoke, that he just kept his head down and did his job. I got the sense that he had begun a long, difficult journey toward accountability, one he would have to walk alone. The papers we signed in Omaha had made sure of that. I found no joy in their exile. My satisfaction, my peace, came from something else entirely. I met with Ms. Albright and the Trust's advisors, and for the first time, I understood the incredible gift Frank had left me. It wasn't just money. It was the power to continue his life's work. We created a grant program, the Ellis Family Agricultural Trust Grant, for young farmers in our county who were struggling to get their start. I began to use Frank's legacy to help them with down payments on land to invest in new equipment. My home, which had once felt like a prison, was suddenly filled with life again. It was full of the boisterous energy of young families, their children chasing each other around my yard while I discussed crop yields and soil health with their parents. I wasn't just a lonely old widow anymore. I had a purpose. I was honoring my husband by investing in the future of the land he loved so deeply. A year later, I was sitting on my porch swing, watching the sunset, painting the endless Nebraska sky in shades of orange and purple. The cornfields across the road were tall and full, rustling in the evening breeze. Dale was beside me, a glass of iced tea sweating in his hand, just as he was most evenings. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. We spoke of the coming harvest of the new baby one of the young farm families was expecting. There was no mention of Mark or Tessa. They were a part of a different story, a closed book on a dusty shelf. I leaned my head back, feeling the gentle rhythm of the swing, a deep sense of peace settling over me. I was grateful for the land, for the quiet wisdom of the husband I still missed every day, and for the simple, unshakable strength I had found in myself. I was home. In the end, Ruth's story became a quiet lesson in the nature of true strength. It showed that betrayal is often born from the bitter soil of desperation and shame, not from simple greed. Faced with the ugly consequences of her son's fear, she chose a path that was just not cruel. Her victory wasn't found in their ruin, but in her own peace. She proved that sometimes the most powerful act isn't vengeance, but the calm, unshakable resolve to protect the life and legacy you have built with your own two hands.